up, guys? My name is Colin. I want to welcome you back to the Nicaea 3 YouTube channel. And today we're going to be doing a deep dive into the thought and the exquisite beauty that exists within the philosophical proofs given for the existence of God by St. Thomas Aquinas in the Summa Theologia. Now, for those who are not familiar, essentially what St. Thomas is doing at this part of the Summa is he is working through various philosophical lines of reasoning and certain concepts that could have even been agreeable to figures such as Aristotle and Plato for reasoning to a monotheistic God. As a matter of fact, when Saint Paul on the Mount of the Areopagus in Athens is walking up to the Areopagus and he sees an altar dedicated to an unknown God, and then he reasons that this God is the Holy Trinity, is Yahweh, and then is Christ in the person of is God the Son in the person of Jesus Christ. That what Saint Paul is doing here is he's using the thought pattern that the philosophical reasoning skills that existed within the ancient Greek philosophical circles. And he's saying this God whom you can reason to through philosophy is the same as the triune God. So St. Paul does this in the Acts of the Apostles, okay? Now, this is not to say that these 5 ways, which we're going to go over, are the only ways of knowing God. They're certainly not the only realities of God. The Summa is very long, right? There's the attributes of God. There's these philosophical proofs. In our modern world, we could add scientific proofs. And then certainly there's the character and the nature of the triune God as understood in the fullness of the faith, okay? With that said, these 5 philosophical proofs are still of extraordinary value, I would say, for understanding who God is, how God functions, and really for those who have eyes to see and ears to hear, how really they provide certainty of this notion of the necessity for the one who simply is, the one who is, I am who I am, the name of God as given to Moses on Mount Sinai. Now, real quickly, before we go any further in this video, keep in mind that a subscription specifically can really help this channel to grow in its early stages. We recently moved past 150 and we're now on the way to 1,000. But any level of support you can give us there can really help us to grow. So I want to give a quick plug of that for that before we move forward. Okay. So what are the 5 ways of St. Thomas Aquinas specifically? Okay. These are going to be the way from motion is number 1. Number 2 is the way from causation. Number 3 is the way from contingency. Number 4 is the way from gradation. And number 5 is the way from teleology. Okay, now, I know those are big words. I'm going to break those down real quick. One other thing I just want to say real quick. There's a great video put out. It's an older video that was put out by Pints with Aquinas. At this point, it was the Matt Fradd show, where Matt Fradd and Father Gregory Pine are discussing this. And one thing they say is, none of these are going to like singe off an eyebrow, or it's not going to blow your socks off, okay? But when fully and properly understood, the philosophical depth and reasoning to these lines of thinking really, I would say, are they're unquestionable. They're as solid as you can get. And so when you really understand the reality and the profundity of the depths of these arguments, taken as a whole, they give a very strong philosophical framework for the necessity of the one who simply is. Okay, so keep that in mind as we go into these. It's not that you're going to hear one and they sound abstract, and then you go, okay, well, that solves everything for me. What they do is for those who are really open to the notion of reason and logic and premises leading to conclusions. It's a scholastic way of thinking. It's a medieval way of thinking that really sets the course for reasoning just in general. But for those who are open to that, these really do provide an extremely sound and a bulletproof, really, argument for the necessity of the one who simply is. Okay, so with that said, let's hop into the first way, the way from motion. Okay, now this one's a little bit abstract, but St. Thomas Aquinas also talks about this simply being evident to the senses, okay, when you really grasp the argument. So what it is saying is that when one thing goes from being an actual possibility to a realized possibility, that this cause, basically this thing which brought it from possibility to actualization, okay, that movement from one to the other is what I'm going to term in this case movement. Okay, so movement does not simply mean moving from like one place to another place. Okay, it can also mean one potential reality being brought into actualization. Okay, so for example, my hand is currently here, and it's potentially here, or it's potentially here, but something has to actualize it to bring it here. Okay. And so whatever actualized that reality, in this case, the neurons in my brain working to move it, okay, something brought that to be. Okay. Or for example, I'm sitting right now. I'm potentially standing. I'm potentially knocking over the camera, right? I'm potentially you know, running outside, okay? But what I'm not potentially doing is flying, okay? So the potential realities have to exist within possibilities, okay? But in order for any of those things to occur, in order for me to stand up, something has to actualize that reality, okay? And in fact, the fact that I'm sitting now, something actualized that reality. And then something actualized the reality that came before that. When an apple is here, for it to brown, something has to actualize that potential to happen. It's possible that it didn't happen. It could have instead been eaten, okay? But in order for that to happen, something would have to actualize it. Now, philosophically, what happens is you can continue going back and back and back and back on things that actualize potentials that have already happened. And then you can look into the future and say what things could happen that could actualize these potential realities. But if you go back in time, okay, what you cannot philosophically have is an eternal regress. And I'm going to use that terminology a lot in the course of this video. You cannot have an eternal regress of actualizations, okay? Because that's philosophically impossible, okay? It doesn't mathematically cohere as a possibility that, well, this brought about this actualization, and this brought about this, and this brought about this. That goes, but eventually you can't have an eternal regress, okay? Because that leads to an impossibility. Okay, and that's going to be at the core of so many of the ways is you can't have an eternal regress. Okay, just to give one example, this is, well, I'll get to that in the second way. Okay, so since you cannot have an eternal regress of causes, since that's philosophically impossible, okay, what has to occur is there has to be something at the beginning of the line that is unactualized in itself, that is an unactualized actualizer, or is an unmoved mover, okay? And this unactualized actualizer, or this unmoved mover who is necessitated at the beginning, we refer to as God, the one who is, okay? So you could think about, again, God is so much more. I'm not saying that God is just an abstract reality at the beginning. God is present, and that's the Judeo-Christian framework, right? That God creates outside of space and time, but also interacts within space and time. So don't hear me saying that's all you need. Certainly, you need the Holy Trinity, and you need the faith, right? The one holy Catholic and apostolic faith. With that said, this still speaks of God as one who is necessitated to put all things that actualize and all things that are in motion, all things that could potentially happen. Something sets them into being, and this reality is the one whom we know as God, the one who is. Okay, so that is the first way. He's the unmoved mover and the unactualized actualizer. And again, St. Thomas Aquinas says this one in particular is evident to the senses for those who see. Now, the second one is similar, yet it's a little bit distinct, okay? And in this one, we could also flesh this out with certain modern scientific arguments for God. But the second one is the way from causation, okay? Now, what this means is rather than movement being actualized, what this is about is it's about causes. So this causes this, and this causes this, and you cannot have, in the same way as the first, an eternal regress of causes. Therefore, God is the one who is the uncaused first cause, okay? Now, when I said I was going to come back to this, if you know about this, Aristotle used to think that the universe was stagnant, that we had a steady state universe, basically one that had never had a beginning, and that was just kind of always was, okay? Now, when you really sit with that for a while, it doesn't really mathematically cohere either. But that was kind of the standard for a lot of philosophical circles for millennia, okay? Now, I'm a believer that modern science can really be a helpful tool. I think of science as thinking the thoughts of God after he already thought them. which is a beautiful line if you sit with that long enough. Science is thinking the thoughts of God after he already thought them. Okay, it's not in competition with faith when properly put in its place, subservient to theology, and to the witness of the faith and of the scriptures. With that said, God being the uncaused first cause, well, this sounds a lot to me like Big Bang cosmology, right? This notion of that the universe came into being, that there was a time when the universe was not, and then the universe came into being. It's called it's well, sorry. It's a beautiful, it's a beautiful reality of what's going on in our cosmos. Ex nihilo. Sorry, I was blanking there for a second. It's creation ex nihilo. It's out of nothing God brings into being that which is. Okay? And so God creates ex nihilo. Well, this is discovered, by the way, Big Bang cosmology comes from a Jesuit priest, a Roman Catholic priest. That concept comes into being. It's true, but I'm saying that the scientific argument for the universe having a beginning actually comes from a Christian priest. And it fits beautifully with what the scriptures had always said was true, that no, we don't live in a steady state universe. We live in a universe that was in fact created, that had an uncaused first cause, okay? And that uncaused first cause, whom we refer to, is God, right? Now, a lot of non-believers will say, they'll argue for other things that can cause it. But I think, for one, they misunderstand the Christian concept of God, that God exists outside of space and time, so science can't speak against God. And then secondly, I think they misunderstand that the beautiful cosmos that we see and the complexity of it, we'll get to this in way number 5 with teleology, but the complexity of it clearly speaks to the one bringing it into being, that there's beauty, that there is intelligence, that there's order, and that there's goodness, right? Which is God, right? That's the basic framework of monotheism, leading us, in fact, to the greatest concept of God you could ever have, which is triune God, a God who is love in and of himself. Okay, there's one God in 3 persons, and that one God exists in an eternal love relationship with himself, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Okay, with that said, again, the second way being that God is the uncaused first cause. It makes a lot of rational and beautiful sense in the midst of our modern world, okay, and in just what we see around us. So that's way number 2. Okay, it also fits beautifully. If you want to do more research, you can look at the Kalam cosmological argument as proposed by Dr. William Craig and others as well. But the Kalam cosmological argument is a profound one. Okay, now with that said, the way number 3. Let's move on to that at this point. Okay. So way number 3, and this is the one that Friar Gregory Pine and Matt Fradd in the video I talked about a while back, that they think is the strongest, and the one that, if you really understand it, can draw people the most in a sense. But the third way is the way from contingency. Okay, now I know that word, in some people's parlance, that's a common word, and in others it's not. But to be contingent means that you require something else to explain your own existence. Okay, so if we're just saying, this camera playing is contingent upon me pressing the button, well, it's contingent upon an outside force, me allowing it to play the video, right? To be contingent means that you do not explain in and of yourself your own existence. Okay, so really, in a sense, everything in our cosmos is contingent. Okay, everything. The universe itself is contingent. The planets are contingent. The human beings are contingent. They don't explain within themselves their own necessity to exist. Okay. Another example you could give are, why do deer exist but not unicorns? Right. Well, there are external factors that bring that reality to be the way that it is. There's no necessity that one exists and the other does not. Okay. And so when you start to grasp this way of thinking, it brings us to the age-old philosophical question, why is there something rather than nothing? Okay, which is maybe the best argument you could ever propose to an atheist as a theist is why is there something rather than nothing? And for those, again, with ears to hear and eyes to see and feelings to feel, I'll add that in as well, that it necessitates the reality for one who simply is. And in this way, we can label God as the non-contingent ground of all contingent reality. God is the one who is non-contingent because he does explain in and of himself why he exists. Okay, and then he explains why all contingent things exist as well. Okay, so the argument from contingency says things exist, okay, yet they cannot explain in and of themselves why they exist. Therefore, this requires one who is non-contingent to bring all contingent reality into being. Okay, now again, atheists will find a way to say, well, maybe there's some other force that brings people into being. But again, I think they come with all sorts of preconceived notions of who we're saying God is. God is the one who is. God is. God is being itself. Okay, now this is not pantheism. Okay, this is complicated technical language, but the proper language would be God is being itself. God gives being to all that which has being, and all that which has being derives its being from God. Okay, this is traditional, classic Christianity. Okay, with that said, that's not saying that the whole universe is God. Again, remember, God creates the universe from outside of space and time. So God is not equivalent with the universe. That would be pantheism. God is separate from the cosmos, and he brings the cosmos into being and then intimately relates with that cosmos. That's the basic philosophical framework of Christianity. Okay, and that's what St. Paul is arguing for in the Areopagus as superior to the Greek philosophical views, which were either basically pantheism, Stoicism, or Epicureanism, which is like ancient deism, right? That like God created and then never intervened. Neither of those are accurate. Rather, God does create and then he does intervene. Okay, with that said, God is still being. Okay, God is pure being, and therefore the one who is pure being brings all contingent realities into being because of his non-contingent reality. He is the explanation for all contingency. That is way number 3. If you sit with that for long enough, it can really, really bring a beautiful concept to your mind of just the profundity and the indescribability of who our God is. Okay, now number 4 is going to be the way from gradation. Okay, now I know this is a big word, but the concept is pretty basic. It's basically saying if we can say that this thing here is good and that this thing here is also good, but this second good is actually a higher good than this good. Okay, so for example, it is good for me to tie my children's shoes when they go to school. That is good. Okay, however, it's a higher good to teach them about God. Right? It's good to stop at red lights and follow, the traffic lights. Okay. However, it's a greater good to help a poor widow who's struggling and who has no means of feeding herself. Okay, that there's a gradation here between good levels of goodness. And what this argument is saying is, if there are different levels of goodness, then there is an ultimate goodness that we can measure all things by, and this ultimate goodness is the one whom we call God. Okay, so God is perfect goodness. Okay, this is good, God is perfect good. It's a grade. Okay, and again, this is philosophically necessitated, that there's not just an eternal regress, or not eternal regress is the wrong language. There's not just an eternal grade, but there is a perfect good by which we measure all other goods off of. Okay, and again, it gives a scholastic way of understanding these kinds of philosophical concepts. Okay, so that's way 4, the way from gradation. Now, way 5 is the way from teleology. Okay, now if you know the Greek word telos, what this means is basically the end of something. Okay, so the telos of my life, I pray, is to honor and glorify God with all of my being, and then to grow into reflecting the Holy Trinity, and then to be with him forever. Okay, and to draw others in my life, my wife, my children, and all those around me, the best I can, into that same reality, into that same life. That's my telos. Okay, the telos of running this YouTube channel is to serve the Lord and to do ministry as he's called me to do. That's the telos of this. Okay, the telos of me going for, I may do this, we'll see. But if I go for a jog later today, the telos is to get into better shape, right? To take care of the physical part of my, of my reality, my physical body. Things have a telos. Okay, however, there are those things which cannot explain why they do what they do. So the example that Aquinas uses is honeybees. Why do honeybees pollinate flowers even if they don't have the intelligence to recognize this whole chain going on in the natural world? Okay, it's working for a telos, or for an end that it cannot in and of itself explain. This is also true about things without a brain at all. So why does the moon bring about the beautiful tidal patterns that allow for life to exist on planet Earth? Okay, because, well, the gravitational pull of the moon is working for a telos that it cannot in and of itself explain. Okay, now I know modern skeptical mind could just say, well, that's chance. That gets us into a whole nother realm. Keep in mind the teleological argument, the scientific argument, at some point I'd love to do a video on this too, is a little bit distinct from this, but I want to touch on this real quick here. That's basically arguing the mathematical, how mathematically incomprehensible it would be that things exist the way that they do in our current cosmos. I've heard this probability said before, again, if you allow for Big Bang cosmology. If you were to do a probability such as 0.000001% chance, if you take statistics class, for example, in high school, what they tell you is once you get enough zeros, like just a few after the decimal point before a 1, that you basically just write it as 0. Right, the probability, because it's so low. Well, when we're talking about the elements necessary at the formation of at the Big Bang to allow for human life to exist, there are more zeros even with just a couple of the elements required or things to happen. There are more zeros in that chain of probability after the decimal point before a 1. I've heard that there are more zeros in that probability chain than there are, get this, subatomic particles in the entire universe. Okay, there are more zeros in the probability chain that things would randomly be as they are. There are more zeros in that probability than there are subatomic particles in the entire cosmos. Okay, I think that would lead us to write down a 0 if we were in statistics class. And again, I say that respectfully. I don't say that to be attacking or degrading of any viewpoints. But I do want to state the firmness and the profundity of the Christian claim and the solidity of it. We need to know that as Christians. Our faith is one of coherence, it's one of goodness, truth, and beauty, and it's also one of rational coherence and logical thinking. And I mean that in the most respectful and kind sense that I can. Okay, so that would be the teleological argument as to why things need to be the way they are. Again, getting back to the fifth way, the way from teleology is saying, why do things work for ends? Okay, and so what St. Thomas's reasoning here is that if things work for ends, it's because there is something which directs their telos, okay? And the one who directs the telos of all things is the one whom we call God. Okay, so let's go over those again real quick. The way from number 1, the way of motion. Number 2, the way of causation. Number 3, the way of contingency. Number 4, the way of gradation. Number 5, the way of teleology. And put together, these give a beautiful philosophical framework, again, for the depths and the rationality of the Christian claims of God, the one simply who is, the one who is, I am that I am, Yahweh. God's peace to you, my friends. If you like this content, keep in mind, again, a subscription can really help us. I pray you have a blessed day today, and we'd love to see you in the next video. Go out and serve the Lord. And again, don't just try to win it. Well, not again, but the first time I'll say, don't just try to win an argument with this, win the person. And so do it with kindness and respect. But I do want to say, I think these give a really, really solid grounding, philosophical grounding for us as Christians to stand upon. And we need to lean into that. God's peace, y'all. Take care. And we'll see you guys in the next one.